Perfect. So thank you all so much for joining us today to talk about the role of seaweed farming in nature-based solutions. Just before we dig into some specific presentations, I'm just going to give a quick kind of overview on Earthly and the role that seaweed farming and nature-based solutions can play. So, why are we focused on nature-based solutions here at Earthly? So we face, two interlinked crises: climate breakdown and ecological collapse. And the great thing about nature-based solutions is they can help us tackle both. And actually, nature-based solutions can provide a third of the greenhouse gas mitigation needed by 2030. Yet they only receive 3% of funding. So we're really focused on, how can we accelerate investment towards nature? How can we bridge this funding gap? And excitingly, nature-based solutions, they can not only remove carbon, they can restore biodiversity, but also support those people who are at the forefront of the climate crisis as well. So we've spent a lot of time, looking at what ecosystems are underrepresented, and whereas today a lot of the focus has been on sort of forestry, tree planting, and forest protection. There's a broad range of different types of projects and ecosystems and interventions that can contribute to the 10 gigaton a year opportunity. So that includes peatlands, grasslands, regenerative farming, and of course within the blue carbon space, kelp, which we'll be diving into a bit more detail today, mangroves and seagrasses. So just sort of looking at seaweed farming and reforestation and looking at a macro kind of view. So globally, seaweeds sequester 200 million tons of carbon a year, and 1 ton of seaweed can capture 120 kgs of CO2. And on the biodiversity front, seaweed covers 43% of global marine ecosystems, so huge coverage around the world, and provides a host of co-benefits, including home to fishes and vertebrates and small marine species and large mammals. And there's a wealth of SDGs that seaweed farming reforestation supports: no poverty, zero hunger, gender equality, decent work and economic growth, responsible consumption, life and water, and climate action. And at Earthly, we're really focused on not only drilling down into the climate benefits of projects, but also the biodiversity and the social impacts, to create a really holistic kind of view as to the benefits from a project. So within climate, that includes the usual things like additionality, permanence, leakage. But within biodiversity, it captures baseline assessments and ecosystem health and ongoing monitoring. And then within people, it looks at the social benefits. So, community, free and prior informed consent, land ownership, healthcare, education, and various other social benefits. And again, just to kind of step back, our mission is to remove a gigaton of carbon exclusively from nature-based solutions by 2030. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to pass over to Dan. And Dan, it's great to see you. We have, and so just before I quickly pass over to Dan, I'm going to launch a quick poll, because we'd love to kind of learn a bit more from our watchers, what they want to take away from the webinar, and what the primary learnings they'd like to take away. So I've just launched that, so you should see that popping up. And then that will also steer some of our questions that we will dig into a bit more detail later. So Dan, yeah, thanks so much for joining us. It's great. I know we originally met just over a year ago, and Dan's the development director at Blue Marine Foundation, which is a charity dedicated to restoring the ocean to health by addressing overfishing and one of the world's biggest environmental problems. And so Dan, would love to hear a bit more about the amazing work that you're doing.
Thanks, Ollie, and thanks for the introduction. I'll just share my screen. And yeah, thanks to Earthly for putting this together. And, it's a topic that's getting hotter and hotter and more exciting as time goes on. This is some kelp, some golden kelp off Lundy Island in North Devon. I don't know whether anyone watching this has been there. It's a pretty extraordinary place for a number of reasons. One of them is that it's one of our oldest no-take zones. It was designated in 2003. And what you see when you get in the water there is a lot of abundance. You know, you see a lot of life. The point that Oliver was making about biodiversity, you know, if you get under the water and dive in this kelp, you see a lot more species, you see bigger fish, you see more crustaceans, and it's a really, you know, evidence of the power of kelp as a habitat. And you know, it's a wonderful place. Unfortunately, it's only 4 kilometers squared, and our country has something like 9 kilometers squared of properly protected areas. You know, about the size of Richmond Park in London, which is you know, pretty indicative of how much we understand or how little we understand the sea. And I think it's quite telling. You know, I spoke on a panel about kelp at COP27 alongside Carlos Duarte, a leading blue carbon scientist, and a couple of and a few other, you know, very esteemed panelists. And it's incredible, really, that in the process like COP, trees, you know, receive huge, you know, multi-billion-dollar commitments, and kelp, which, as Ollie said, it offers incredible co-benefits, grows incredibly quickly, is, you know, this sort of subterranean super plant, as many other macroalgae are. It completely overlooked in the conversation. That was the only panel about seaweed in the whole of COP26. And you can sort of, if you follow the money back on that, you can sort of see very clearly how much the ocean's overlooked and how much remains to be done in terms of funding Goal 14, life below water. You know, as you can see, it's a tiny fraction of global funding. You know, just 0.56% of SDG philanthropy from 2016 on. And I'm really fascinated by the potential for seaweed farming, and particularly the kind of global spark of interest in it, to address some of that balance, to bring more money into this space, if it's done right. And, you know, that's incredibly vital right now, as you can see from this little table, which is from a paper we put together about the voluntary blue carbon market. We're losing all of these things, some of them incredibly fast. You know, if you look at seagrass, for instance, you know, you can't lose stuff at 7% per annum for very long before you lose it all. In the UK, you know, we've lost 90% of seagrass in my lifetime, which is very sad, and it's a sort of borne out in terms of wild kelp. And as we lose these things, we lose all of the values that they provide, both in terms of carbon sequestration, but all of the other co-benefits described. But it's incredibly hopeful, I think, the sea in general, but also kelp and other macroalgae themselves, because their rate of growth and the scale they achieve, and we find that consistently across the sea. If you leave it alone to recover, it recovers very quickly. And I'm fascinated by the potential for some seaweed farming to be conducted that, you know, has permanent structures that sit in the sea, that harvest the sort of interest on the capital, as it were, rather than taking the whole structure out of the water every time, and effectively establishes a sort of permanent sanctuary site for species, and creates carbon benefits alongside that. Kelp carbon's pretty complicated, though. I don't know anyone saw this report come out. It's literally come out yesterday or the day before. It's well worth a read. And you know, some fantastic authors on there. Scottish Association of Marine Sciences, you know, incredible institution who are very far ahead on studying all of this stuff. But ultimately, the conclusions are, you know, that we still don't really know very much, and that's very tricky if you're trying to structure particularly carbon projects. You know, we don't really know how much it can be stored for relevant time periods. But there's lots of potential and lots of exciting potential as well. But it is pretty complicated. Every single site is completely different. If you imagine you're trying to quantify carbon sequestration from a kelp farm, there's so many different factors that affect that. You know, the species that you're growing, which other panelists know much more about, the current, the seabed, the productivity of the marine environment around you, and that's quite hard. This in, you know, some of the projects we've looked at, this has led to a bit of skepticism about the role of kelp as a carbon sequestering habitat, and you know, it's made more complicated. It's compared to something like mangroves, which simply, you know, put their roots down and sequester carbon. You know, kelp isn't like that. It's a sort of donor and receiver. Bits of the biomass fall off as it grows. That biomass goes somewhere, but really, that somewhere is the important bit when you're talking about carbon sequestration. It's all about the sediment and where the carbon falls and how that's sequestered over what time period. And kelp carbon projects in the future will have to protect the sink as well as the source. But there's an incredible amount of appetite and interest in getting to that point, and that's really exciting. I think in terms of global policy, for the first time, I'm hearing the people in the middle of the blue carbon world say, yes, we will have kelp carbon projects, we will have kelp to build into NDCs and into national inventories in the future, which is a massive change in the last couple of years and shows, you know, the great work of all of the different people working on seaweed farms is being recognized. I'm sure many people are aware, but there's plenty of work going on in terms of developing methodologies. I think I know 3 different organizations who are working on this. Carlos Duarte has come up with some conclusions already. I think he launched them officially at Monaco Ocean Week earlier this year. And his statistics are pretty encouraging in terms of carbon sequestration. And I think in the coming months and years, we will see methodologies come online and we'll see the ability for these to become projects. However, there is a complexity here, and that is that the way in which the sea is governed is incredibly complicated. And it's quite often lots of men in a room not hitting each other with fish, but effectively having big fights. And in this country particularly, I think the nascent seaweed farming industry has been frustrated by the permitting process. It's taken a lot longer than it should have done. I'm hoping that obstruction, is starting to be overcome. And in a lot of the restoration work we do around oysters and other habitats, we are finding that is beginning to get easier. So I'm very much looking forward to, that process being smoothed out. There's a lot of work going on to bring together stakeholders in this country to move the permitting process forward. I'll end there and pass back to you, Ollie. Delighted to chat more with anyone in the Q&A and beyond.
Thanks so much, Dan, for that overview. And if we have time in the Q&A, I'd love to delve into the the nature tech side of the monitoring and to sort of see what's happening in this space. Because as you say, the nature of kelp being underwater and the lack of geospatial kind of analysis or limited geospatial analysis, it's a really fascinating area I'd love to touch on if we have a bit of time. And so for next, I'd love to pass over to Jan Verbeek, who is scientific manager for SeaForester, which is an organization dedicated to reversing the alarming disappearance of seaweed forests in the world.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, I was still on mute. Thanks very much, Oliver, and to Planet Earth for inviting me. It's an exciting webinar. So I'm not really going to talk about the farming side of things. our organization, as Oliver already said, it's really dedicated to seaforestation, so actually bring back these wild seaweed forests and especially kelp forests across our coastlines. So today I'll be talking a bit about how seaforestation can revive these lost ocean habitats. And I think I start a bit by taking a step back. So I kind of wanted to imagine a forest on land that I think that we are quite familiar with. So forests on land, they sequester carbon, they produce oxygen, they're a source of timber, other natural resources, and they really provide a habitat for an abundance of other plants and animals. Now, we have a very similar ecosystem right in front of our coastlines. So seaweed forests, and here we're looking at a kelp forest, which Dan already showed earlier. And these kelp forests really form impressive, like three-dimensional underwater habitats in the shallow coastal zones along our coastlines. And this area we refer to as our blue front yard. We'll go back into that a bit later. So these ecosystems, again, Dan already alluded to a lot of this. They can sequester carbon at least 5 times more efficiently than tropical forests on land. They can sequester really large amounts of excess nutrients and pollutants from coastal waters and improve water quality. They can even reduce the energy of breaking waves and protect our coastlines, which is quite an increasing issue with sea level rise and intensification of storms. And perhaps also one of the main valuable function is that habitat it creates, because it really supports an incredible biodiversity from small little snails and crustaceans all the way to marine mammals and then to human society, obviously. They also have a lot of those commercially valuable fish species, like cod in Norway is really highly dependent on kelp forests, for example. So they are supporting productive coastal but also offshore fisheries. And the habitat is also quite nice for recreational activities like scuba diving, for example. So there's a big recreation tourism value attached to that as well. And just like seaweed farming, that's a bit more of the focus of this webinar. You can harvest, obviously, wild seaweed forests as well, if you do that in a sustainable way without impacting them too much. And that biomass can really then be used for a lot of the applications like human consumption, animal feed, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, and all the other materials you can produce. So overall, you can really see seaweed forest ecosystems as some of the most important and valuable habitats on the planet. And currently, in economic terms, they are valued between 500,000 and $1 million per kilometer of coastline. So that's quite an impressive economic value already. Many more studies are currently underway to really get a more accurate picture of the economic aspect of it, but also the value in terms of the social level. And this will be quite important in the future also if we are trying to get investment and funding for the restoration. We need to know exactly how much these ecosystems are worth. Now, hitting a bit on the topic of the webinar, also the role of seaforestation in meeting some climate action targets. Again, Dan alluded to this very well earlier. Give very accurate estimates right now because it's inherently difficult to measure that or to quantify that carbon potential. The nice thing with actual restoration of seaforestation is that, first of all, by restoring a seaweed forest, you're locking up carbon in its living biomass, or the standing crop already. That's the first way to solve the carbon. The second one is that, like Dan said, there is a part of that annual productivity is actually exported away from the seaweed habitats. It's not stored like seagrasses or land forests in the soil because kelps and other seaweeds, they grow on rock. But this can really be exported far away. And these are estimates from a study done in 2016. I think that's the latest and most to-date study we have. And they are estimated that around 10% of that productivity can actually end up in the deep sea. Now, why is that important? The deep sea is quite an inert environment. So all the biomass and the carbon that's exported there actually can stay there for hundreds of thousands of years. So then it's actually a good support contribution to mitigating climate change because it needs to be stored away for a long period of time. Also, compared to other ecosystems, if it's stored in the deep sea, it's a bit more of a safe storage, if you want to see it that way, Because if you imagine the kelp forest disappears due to whatever impacts, the carbon that's in the deep sea stays there. If you look at a seagrass meadow or a land forest, if they burn down, well, maybe not the seagrass, they don't burn, but then the CO2 is released from the soils and goes back into the atmosphere. So kelp forests are quite valuable in that sense. And this is a little exercise we made. So if you look at restoring 5,000 square kilometers, you might look at something along the lines of 2.5 million tons stored in living biomass and around 500,000 tons per year stored long-term in the deep sea or also continental shelf sediments. Now at SeaForester, our main dedication, like Oliver said earlier, is really the restoration of these habitats. And we're aiming to implement our seaforestation projects through an approach we call the Blue Front Yard approach. So the main aim is really that we want coastal communities to look at their blue front yard and their natural marine resources the same way as they look at their green backyards and their green spaces and forests on land. So that's quite a common thing. You manage your forests, you manage your green spaces for the benefits that they provide for your coastal or for your local communities. Now, the same thing can be done in the sea. And our approach is really working with coastal communities, bringing together industry, science, local authorities, and any other stakeholder that's really important, and together implement those restoration actions. And with the aim to really ultimately empower those communities to become the guardians of their own natural resources. One important thing really is to use scalable restoration techniques for this, because the scale of loss is immense. Like Oliver said at the beginning, it's nearly 2% per year that we're losing of kelp forest, so that's a huge amount. So we at SeaForester are aiming predominantly at this green gravel technique. It's not our only technique, but this is kind of what we're focusing on right now. It's quite a simple technology, actually. It's small stones that we seed with kelp spores, and those we grow out in land-based nurseries we have, and then they simply deployed in the ocean by scattering them from the surface from a boat, and through that then really try and restore those ecosystems. Now, we are also developing kind of containerized units at the moment, so we can expand to different countries, because yes, we are placed in Portugal, but our aim is to be global. So these container units we want to implement now. We have one in the planning for Germany, for example, and want to then bring all the stakeholders together at the local level to get the appropriate financing for it, and yeah, to try and really start restoring, because action needs to be done now. We're in the decade of ecosystem restoration, so we only have a couple of years left, really. So yeah, so that's it from me for now. Happy to answer any questions later in the Q&A, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan. That's really fascinating. And I think the ecosystem services value, like understanding the real economic kind of value of protecting and restoring sort of seaweeds is really fascinating. And I think it's a really powerful lever for us to use to drive investment and to increase the value of the restoration work that's happening as well. So again, we'd love to dig into a bit more detail on that in the Q&A a bit later. Just before we go on to the next section, just to quickly share some of the insights from the poll. So more than half of the attendees are keen to understand the role of seaweeds in net zero. Then a third of people are interested in general education and seaweed farming and reforestation, and then about 13% of people looking which specific seaweed projects could they invest in. So that I'll just share the results for that. And so yeah, just going on quickly to the next section. I'm just going to share my screen. We have we finally want to just touch on Biome algae, and which is one of the projects that we're working with at Earthly. And they're a sustainable seaweed farming and research company with a demonstrated history of working in the environmental services industry. Unfortunately, Angela, who is going to be joining us as CEO, is not very well. So my colleague Olivia Crow, who is Earthly's head of research, is going to step in for Angela and just share an overview of their work of building a farm seaweed biome that supports circular societies. So Olivia, over to you.
Thank you, Ollie. Yeah, so I'll share a briefer version of the original presentation Angela shared. For anyone who'd like to learn more, I'm sure we can share the extended version of this presentation as well, because Biome are doing some really incredible work in the southwest of the UK. So they're an innovative venture. They're in the second year of their seaweed farming, and they're currently the biggest seaweed farm in England. So the team at Biome, they see seaweed farming as a promising solution for blue growth from the ocean, whilst also protecting it, creating jobs, and supporting a strong social agenda. And they're currently collaborating across academia and industry to explore the social, biodiversity, and climate opportunities. So just staying on this slide, the industry, it's evolving really quickly. And this means that there's many new applications and markets that are being realized. So this includes solutions for food security, health, fertilizers in agriculture, and biomaterials. And Biome will be playing a key role in these markets as both a producer of the seaweed and a processor. So that includes supplying the seaweed specifically, as well as the extracts for seaweed derived products. And this has the opportunity to support the circularity of the economy. And one really interesting fact or aspect of seaweed farming is that it means no fertilizers, no feeds, and no waste. So it's really different to agriculture on land. So if we just take a quick look at the next slide, in the European context more broadly, last year we have seen overall investment into the industry increase 10 times, with many companies like Biome developing diverse portfolios of these products and services. And as you can see on the slide, the industry value is projected at 9.6 billion euros by 2030 across all sectors. So that's a huge opportunity. So just moving on to the very final slide of this short intro to Biome's work. Importantly, they've been working with Plymouth and Exeter University to measure the actual impacts of farming on the marine environment. This is something that Angela holds really, really, really important. We really need to develop and build that foundation of evidence around what it will mean to scale up seaweed farming and what impact that will have on the marine environment. And what's great, so they're already seeing some amazing results after 2 years of farming. So they have footage that shows increases of biodiversity right up the food chain, tuna, seals, porpoise, fish, scallops. So that's really exciting. And then finally, we at Earthly, we're also hoping to collaborate to explore this opportunity for carbon sequestration and experimenting with different methodologies when it comes to getting that carbon into the seabed. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation for today. I can also share, so I'll be sharing some insights that Angela has also shared with us in the Q&A to address those bigger questions around the role of seaweed farming in net zero.
Perfect. Thank you, Olivia, for stepping in and giving us a bit of an overview on their work, and also for joining the panel discussion. So we've got some really interesting questions that are coming in. So I think we will kick right off. And the first is to you, Dan. You mentioned about this being the decade of ocean science. You know, how do you kind of see sort of seaweeds faring this decade? How do you sort of see that planning out over the coming years?
It's been a fantastic boost for blue carbon as a space, in that the UN Decade on Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, I think it's called, in its full form, has agreed to create a blue carbon program falling under it, which is quite a big thing. You know, it's fairly niche and contained to our ocean space, but it's still really exciting, and that will give, particularly the blue carbon elements of seaweed, you know, that will give it a good boost. I'm seeing loads of really interesting potential projects coming into our pipeline on this front, which, you know, I probably couldn't have imagined being part of my work 5 years ago or 3 years ago. You know, for instance, we're just mapping the carbon sort of kelp diffusion plume from an island chain, trying to identify, you know, the sink and the permanence of the sink in a changing climate, and then submitting that evidence to a government for potential protection of that sink. And that's incredibly, as a marine conservationist, that's incredibly exciting. You know, that something like kelp could be, you know, valued enough that people protect areas of the sea on that alone. You know, that's a huge shift in profile. I do think seaweed has a bit of a branding problem, and I think it will take time to really filter into public awareness. But I see the trajectory at the moment as super encouraging. I think and it is a big if, one of the things we're supporting is a kelp carbon working group of scientists trying to normalize the consensus around kelp being a blue carbon habitat, which it isn't considered as in global climate change policy. If that ends up going through, we're a tiny part of this, but if a group of leading scientists decides to take kelp through the IPCC process into the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, then things could get very exciting. And so, yeah, I'm incredibly optimistic about the future of the public profile of seaweed moving into this all important decade.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Dan. And Jan, question for you: are there any specific countries or locations or regions better suited for seaweed interventions, and why is that, and where is seaweed restoration needed perhaps the most?
It's not an easy question, not an easy answer. I could talk at length about this, but I think overall there have been some studies looking into where is kelp disappearing, where it is stable, where it's even increasing. So it's not just a loss all across the world, but so like I said, 2% we are overall losing every year. There are some regions I think that are quite fine at the moment. For example, the UK, actually, I have been talking to a lot of researchers there, and to really see, are there any regions in the UK that would need some active interventions to restore kelp forests? And the answer was always no. So the kelp forests are so far doing fine. I mean, with the only exception of the Sussex coast, where there was a big issue with bottom trawling, but now there's a trawling ban in place. And I think even without some active restoration interventions, that kelp forest will eventually come back. So I think in the short term or medium term, the UK is fine. In the long term, there are estimates that the kelp forests will also be impacted obviously with climate change. But right now that is fine. The same story kind of goes for example, for South Africa. They have huge forests there. Anyone who has watched My Octopus Teacher, for example, knows how impressive those forests are. And there as well, there is not a huge need. So where there is a need, there are many regions across the world. And I think at the moment, we want to restore as fast as possible. So we should aim for the low-hanging fruits. Norway, for example, in the 70s, they had a huge explosion of sea urchins. It was like the largest overgrazing event ever observed in the Northeast Atlantic. And I think the sea urchin grazed down something nearly up to 10,000 square kilometers along Norway into Russia. Some of that has recovered since then, but there's still around 8,000 square kilometers covered in urchin barrens. And now a lot of research is being done there to see what management procedures you can implement to remove them. NIVA and IMR, some of these institutes, and they have done some urchin removal trials, for example, and the kelp immediately came back after you remove the urchins. So if that is really done at a larger scale, then that is a really good way to restore,
Just on that, Jan, is there a predator, or is there something that eats sea urchins that could be introduced? Or?
Yeah, I mean, in Norway, there wasn't, obviously, back in the 70s, they weren't doing a study to really record that, but there is a paper also by Norderhaug and some of his colleagues, her colleagues, they were looking at the potential reason why they disappeared. So sea urchins are, especially in Norway, they're predated by crabs, certain crab species, wolffish, this big gray, ugly looking fish. But they were really overfished in the past. And the general consensus is that because of the sea urchin predators were decimated, the urchins exploded. I mean, some climate factors also play a certain role there. But if you can reintroduce those predators whilst removing the urchins, I think you're looking at a much faster recovery as well as a more permanent recovery.
Yeah, fascinating. I've got just a general question here from someone asking when we should expect seaweed carbon codes, and should we expect credits from emissions reduction or carbon removal perhaps first? And they mentioned different types of seaweed interventions face different types of challenges. So I don't know if Dan or Jan, you've got any sort of insights to share on that.
Yeah, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, maybe Dan, you actually have more to say than me. I mean, I'm aware through discussions I have had with researchers, for example, Carlos Duarte, because he's very big in that field. I mean, for farming itself, him and Oceans 2050, they were actually looking at the potential for seaweed farming to store carbon in the sediments underneath. So this is, as far as I'm aware, still ongoing at the moment. I think they were supposed to publish their results this year, and they have worked with several seaweed farms in Europe, in the States, and I think they're trying to really get a certain carbon credit scheme up and running for that. For natural forests, I have heard different things. Some people say, of course, we will have it. It will take some time because of that issue of really quantifying the carbon potential, especially that export to the deep sea. Others say we will never have them because you can never accurately measure this. And for a carbon credit, you need to be very accurate in, knowing the amount of carbon that's realistically stored. Otherwise, you're just selling something and you're not storing anything realistically, in the real world. But yeah, I mean, that's as far as I can contribute to this.
I think that's pretty spot on, Jan. I mean, we're funding 3 different sort of projects looking at the potential for wild kelp carbon codes, and they're, as Jan said, there's a lot of complexity, and there's no certainty of a route to market due to permanence. I mean, kelp. I keep saying kelp, and I know this is about seaweed more generally, but kelp's the macroalgae I know more about. Kelp is prone to just disappearing. In Japanese, there's a word for it, I believe, to describe kelp loss events, where kelp just, for whatever stressor, decides to back up and then come back later on. And if you're trying to account for permanence in wild kelp forests, which you need to have an accurate methodology, that's very, very complicated. But there's a group working on quantification of the recovery of the kelp in the large area of Sussex that was closed in a bylaw last year. I think it's 340 kilometers squared. There's a chance of a group coming together there to create code. Within the Vera Seascape Carbon Initiative, which is something we've supported a bit, there is a lot of talk of a methodology around wild kelp being written. I think the underpinning science is not there yet. I think it's highly probable that what will end up is pretty low level default values. In terms of mangroves, the CDM kind of accepted minimum for soil carbon that people could apply to projects until fairly recently was 0.5 tons per hectare per annum. And many people know, like, mangrove forests can have hundreds or thousands of tons in the sediment per hectare. And I think with kelp, it's going to be very, very hard to prove that, hectare by hectare or even within hectares. So I'd say it's probably work in progress with an uncertain conclusion at this point.
And I guess, Dan, as we were saying, as you mentioned earlier on the monitoring challenges, we had a really fascinating call with Baker Consultants, and they're developing bioacoustics for monitoring. And I remember one of the things they were saying is they've got an underwater microphone for tracking biodiversity. What sort of nature tech are you seeing in the monitoring space? And I guess to both of you, and could is there a bioacoustic solution to help kind of track the progress and the growth and restoration?
I mean, I'm seeing amazing developments in this space all the time, from environmental DNA, really spearheaded by Naturemetrics, an incredible company. There's so much potential with that in terms of quantification of biodiversity, and I know that some of their work, they're looking very closely at carbon, and right through to sort of more even more tech, kind of hyperspectral camera imaging. There's a great company called Plan Blue in the Netherlands who, they can map in kind of infinitesimal changes in the seabed, and therefore, with the right kind of big data algorithm backing that, you could effectively monitor a project incredibly closely and provide the sort of data that we all need. And right through to the kind of global level, there's satellite tech companies out there who could create a blue carbon atlas, showing where all of the blue carbon is in the world. Obviously, seagrass and kelp, it's more complicated because there's much water penetration from the satellites, but there's enough to, I believe, monitor aerial extent up until a surprising depth. And anything that shows it's being ahead above ground at all, so say tidal seagrass, they can form a pretty accurate assumption of habitat quality as well, which is of great importance, because a seagrass bed in bad condition, can be a net carbon source rather than a sink. And so, yeah, I think it's incredibly exciting. Drone tech, big data, as you were saying, bioacoustics. Yeah, I think that it's an incredible frontier, and I know there's people working on trying to bring those solutions together into something that corporates can understand.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think for me, my background pre-Earthly was in products and consumer products and in health drinks, and so actually looking at seaweed, kelp, it's exciting the different uses, whether it's fertilizer, whether it's actually as an additive, and it can be used in so many different ways. Like, how do you kind of see, where does that all sort of fit into the kind of the carbon markets for kelp and the product uses? And I appreciate some uses, mean that the carbon is not sequestered. So like to both of you, like, how do you sort of see that panning out? Do you think that we'll see many more use cases for using kelp in products, or it'll be primarily kind of focusing on the carbon and the biodiversity benefits?
Well, I mean, this again is probably better answered by someone who's doing seaweed farming and is looking much more in detail into the products of it, because our focus is always restoring the natural habitat with the benefits it naturally provides. I mean, some of that is, of course, seaweed harvesting that has been done for centuries in Asia. It has also been done for a long time now in North, and especially northern countries that have a lot of harvesting. And I think farming is very important, so that first of all, we don't impacting our natural forest too much. And in terms of the material applications, I mean, I have seen incredible amount of research and companies that are trying to build new types of plastics out of seaweeds. Some even use them to make textiles. Mm-hmm. And I think as a lot of our other raw materials becoming more expensive or scarce, I mean, looking at seaweed, which is incredibly fast growing, there's a huge potential across our coastlines to actually farm this material. I think it's just an obvious thing to progress with this and do that, but again, like the actual markets growth and those kind of things, I don't know about it.
And I guess kind of linked to that, to Dan, what do you think the implications of healthy seaweed abundance, might be on the cosmetic, food or energy industry, say over the next decade?
I think again, like, it's possibly better answered by someone with more of a knowledge of the market, like Jan. I'm more interested in sort of like sanctuary kelp or kelp that stays in situ in the marine environment. And I think there's probably really good ways of doing seaweed farming, and probably ways of doing seaweed farming that have environmental complexities and organization, and we don't really have a standpoint on that. But effectively, like any sort of value chain, I think it's all about the utilization of the highest possible level of products from kelp. And if we're say, burning kelp for biomass, which is something I've seen as an idea. You know, you're talking about the sort of bottom of the hierarchy. Yeah. And then, you know, as you move up that value chain into kind of high value, you know, flavonoids and sort of interesting antioxidants and that kind of thing, it, you know, it could get super interesting. And I think, yeah, there's plenty of potential there. I think what it needs is very expensive technology and an off taker. You know, that's the conclusion of some of my friends who are closer to the market than me, is that kelp needs people who can say, okay, we're going to take this amount then, because at the moment what's happening is there's lots of demand, but when you get down to transaction, it's small volumes, intermittent amounts, and really hard to meet that the demand of large companies as well from a network of small farms. So you almost need a kind of joining point, and I don't know who that'll be, but I expect they could make a lot of money.
I mean, Dan, for like the minimum demand needed, like what sort of sizes are we talking like ballpark? You know, is it 100,000 tons worth of, or is it linked to a certain area, or?
Yeah, I can't say I really know. I think it would be corporate to corporate, and depending on what they want it for. But yeah, I having worked in, you know, temporarily in a sort of world of selling, you know, those kind of resources, the sort of expected minimum volumes for lots of corporates are astonishingly high, far more than one can make from a, you know, relatively. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the people doing this at scale, I think, probably have the right idea.
Okay. And for businesses looking to invest in impactful seaweed projects, you know, what's the best way for them to play a role right now?
I mean, I think supporting the sort of work that Jan is doing on a no regrets basis, you know, understanding and prototyping and pioneering effectively active restoration methods that one day may create, you know, very investable things for the values that they provide by being left alone. That's what I'd do. I'd invest in Jan personally.
And it's really interesting. We are seeing like businesses come to us and they need a certain amount of carbon for a net zero commitment, let's just say, but actually they are, you know, there's appetite to support innovation and to, you know, to kind of move the dial forward. And so it's quite exciting to see that businesses are prepared to put, you know, 10%, 20% of their investment into projects where there isn't necessarily a kind of a carbon credit link, but they see the longer term potential.
I think that's exactly what both the habitat and the market needs, you know. From my perspective, Jan, I don't know whether you want to build.
I think you pretty much summed it up. I mean, something that we're doing at SeaForester, I mean, I think we are some of the first ones that are actually doing this as a commercial exercise, or at least that's, you know, that's the idea. So far, because seaweed restoration in general and kelp is still quite in its infancy in terms of research compared to a lot of other ecosystems, terrestrial as well as marine. But we don't have time to just do another decade of research. So we're really trying to have the science that exists right now, move it into more of a commercial space. And initially we were meant to be an NGO, but before we actually did the official registration, I realized this needs to be done on a big scale. How do you get the funding to do this on a big scale? You need to have a financially sustainable business model as a for-profit company. And this is why we actually ended up now, well, it's still an initiative. This year it will be implemented as a standalone entity. But I think for us, and thanks Dan for investing in us. I mean, the main thing at the moment is really, and we're probably not the only ones, I'm sure there are other similar companies across the world, is that initial capital that is hard to get by because there is not that real you know, knowledge of people and potential investors, and why should I even invest in this? Why is this important? So as well as doing our research and our actual restoration actions, we're doing a lot of communication, awareness raising, outreach with communities, politicians, everything, just to get it onto their agenda, you know. So I think this initial capital needs, that's quite urgent for not just for us, for everyone in the field.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Olivia, like just I know Angela shared some thoughts, pre the session. Would love to kind of hear, some insights on what we've been discussing from kind of Biome Algae's perspective.
Definitely. I mean, everything that has been discussed around scaling is really key. They see scaling as essential for seaweed to deliver that impact in different markets and industry, but also that the seaweed farming could even support natural populations of seaweed as well, which is, I think, an interesting perspective to think of this from. I mean, just when it comes to that potential, I just shared in the chat, from Angela's side, it's the food and energy industries where there is this huge potential. Seaweed rivals kind of soy and whey when it comes to protein, but there's so many other nutrients as well. So that's huge. And like Dan was saying on biofuels, this impact could be seen in the shipping and long haul flights, which could be really meaningful. And then when it comes to the carbon accounting, when you have seaweed and the carbon captured by seaweed being contained in products throughout a value chain, you could see kind of emissions reductions and more permanent storage happening there, although it becomes incredibly complicated to do that carbon accounting. And from their perspective, that it would be great if we could do that carbon accounting, because it would reflect the real impact that seaweed has on carbon throughout an entire value chain. But just starting at the more simple approach, maybe just trying to offset the farm itself and all of that seaweed processing activities and getting that seaweed into these value chains maybe is a good place to start. And then when a seaweed farm becomes carbon negative, then you can think about generating offsets for industry and the wider world. But yeah, it's a shame Angela couldn't be here today, because I know she's got a lot to share when it comes to these questions.
We'll have to arrange a follow-up session. And in your presentation, you spoke about the kind of economic value of the ecosystem services. I think it was $500,000 to $1 million per kilometer. Like, do you mind just drilling down into a little bit more detail into the specific kind of co-benefits that make that up? And like, how can we like help people understand this value and then use it as a tool to make these investments more valuable?
I mean, I'm always using this estimate because I think that's the only one that was based on, I have to lie now, 4 studies, one from Chile, one actually from Australia, one from South America, and the other one from the top of my head, I can't remember where it was. But they have looked at, they have a kelp forest across a stretch of coastline, and they have looked at, the tourism industry, the fishing industry, and a lot of other things that are reliant on the benefits of kelps. So actually, tourism was quite a big factor there. I think in the Great Southern Reef in Australia, it accounted for something like 40% of that value, something quite big. But across the board, it was mainly the fishing benefits that really were driving that value. I mean, again, the value is really location specific. I mean, in some locations, this kelp forest might harbor a very valuable fishery species, so that then the value of the kelp forest goes up immensely already. Some regions naturally have a good water quality, so this cleanup story that we call it, that might not actually be valued because it's not of interest. Other countries like the North Sea, we had big eutrophication issues in the past. It still is an issue, it's getting better, but there a kelp forest that actually helps to clean up has an enormous value, right? So drilling down into details is very difficult at the moment. There is, however, a study, several studies actually, but there is a global study going on that's driven by some partners of us in Australia, and they want to look at these values all across the world. So they will get some very region-specific values, but also want to do this global synthesis. And this will still take probably until the end of this year, next year for publications. But then we have a much better idea, of what are the different parts that contribute to the value. And I'm sure that value that I presented is an underestimation. It will be much higher than that.
Exciting. Can't wait to see those reports when they're released. And just, I think we've probably got time for one more question, which we've just received, which is saying, can seaweeds absorb heavy metals from the surrounding water? So to either of you, if you'd like to take that.
I can start. I have not looked into any specific papers on this, but it is a story. I mean, they if in the seaweed biomass, when you analyze it, you find heavy metals. I mean, I don't know to what extent they can function as a sponge for these kind of pollutants, but certainly they can take some of that up from the ocean. Yes, I don't know what the extent of that is, to be honest. And I mean, if you have heavily polluted coastal areas where heavy metals are a big issue, I'm sure that's not going to be the only issue. So most likely you might not have kelp there because the water quality is just too bad for it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what? Yeah, I totally think that's spot on. I mean, there's a couple of really interesting instances. I mean, if you take something like oysters, sadly, probably not a net carbon sink, but take huge amounts of nitrates out of the water column. Nitrates are considerably more valuable if you can structure the sort of the sort of method for quantifying them than carbon. And I don't know. I expect kelp does lots of things that we're not really even aware of yet. The valuation of those things will be really exciting. I was very gratified recently to learn of the discovery of a large oyster bed in Rotterdam Harbour, an incredibly kind of well-used, pretty polluted stretch of water. And it's, yeah, I think the tenacity of some of these marine habitats is extraordinary. So yeah, I think in terms of co-benefits, there's a lot more to come in this space.
Amazing. Well, listen, I think it's a good place to wrap it up, but just want to say a huge thank you to you for joining us, Jan and Dan and Olivia stepping in to provide some insights from Angela. And yeah, would love to, you know, to have another follow-up at some point in the future. But yeah, thank you very much for taking the time, and everyone that's joined us today. And we'll make this available as a recording post the session. And wishing you all the very best.
Thank you.
Thanks
Cheers.
all. Take care.
Thank you.